There's a map of Europe you've never seen, one drawn not by borders or battles, but by the courage of sailors who dared to venture beyond the horizon. Think of the medieval world, and you might picture castles, knights, or sprawling kingdoms. But the real story of Europe's expansion wasn't written on land. It was carved into the waves by ships most history books have forgotten. These weren't just voyages, they were leaps into the unknown, each one pushing the limits of what was possible and reshaping the world in ways we're still uncovering today. Imagine standing on the deck of a creaking wooden vessel, the wind filling the sails as the coastline disappears behind you. No GPS, no guarantees, just the stars above and the relentless pull of curiosity. This was the reality for countless explorers, merchants, and adventurers whose names have faded from memory, even though their journeys changed everything. They didn't just cross seas, they connected continents, weaving a web of trade, culture, and ideas that would one day bind the globe together. And yet, their stories have been overshadowed by the more famous names we all know. Until now, in this video, we're setting sail into the past to uncover 25 little-known maritime ventures that quietly expanded Europe's reach during the medieval era. These aren't just footnotes in history, they're the hidden currents that carried Europe into a new age of exploration and influence. From secret trade routes that bypassed empires to forgotten explorers who charted waters no one else dared to enter, these tales reveal how ambition, ingenuity, and sometimes sheer luck redrew the map of the world. So come aboard as we dive into these untold stories, because history isn't just about the destinations, it's about the daring journeys that made them possible. Long before the age of Columbus, when most of Europe still believed the world ended at the horizon, a handful of Norse sailors were already pushing beyond the known edges of the map. Picture this: rough wooden longships cutting through the icy waters of the North Atlantic, their crews braving storms, hunger, and the unknown. These were the voyages of Eric the Red and his followers, who didn't just stumble upon Greenland, they turned it into a European foothold at the edge of the world. Greenland wasn't just another island, it was a proving ground. When Eric arrived in the late 10th century after being exiled from Iceland, he saw opportunity where others saw only frozen wilderness. With clever marketing naming it Greenland to attract settlers, he established colonies that would last for centuries. These weren't temporary camps but thriving communities, complete with farms, churches, and trade networks stretching back to Norway. The Norse didn't just survive there, they adapted, learning to hunt walrus for ivory, a commodity as valuable as gold in medieval Europe. But the real significance of Greenland lies in what came next. From these remote outposts, Norse explorers like Leif Erikson ventured even farther west, reaching the coast of North America around the year 1000. Imagine that: a European presence in the New World, 500 years before Columbus. Yet these voyages were more than just accidents of history. They revealed something extraordinary. The Norse had the skills, the ships, and the sheer stubbornness to cross oceans others feared to sail. Why then did these colonies fade? Climate change played a role. The Little Ice Age made survival even harder, but so did isolation. Without consistent support from Europe, the Greenland settlements dwindled. Yet their legacy endured. The knowledge of these voyages circulated among sailors and mapmakers, whispering of lands beyond the Western Sea. When later explorers like Columbus set sail, they weren't heading blindly into the void. They were following trails first blazed by the Norse. So while Greenland's colonies may have vanished, their impact didn't. They proved that Europe's reach could extend far beyond its shores, planting the seeds for an era of global exploration that would reshape the world. And it all started with a few ships, a lot of courage, and a name that promised more than it delivered: Greenland. While the Norse were braving icy northern waters, another group of Europeans was quietly mastering the Atlantic, not for exploration, but for something far more valuable: whale oil. The Basque whalers of northern Spain and southern France didn't have royal patrons or grand ambitions to discover new lands. Their motivation was simpler: wealth. And in their relentless pursuit, they became some of the most skilled mariners of the medieval world, operating in near-total secrecy to protect their lucrative trade. Picture the Bay of Biscay in the 15th century, where Basque ships would vanish for months at a time. These weren't the sleek caravels of later explorers, but sturdy vessels built for endurance, their holds designed to carry tons of blubber back to Europe. Whale oil was the medieval equivalent of crude oil: lighting lamps, waterproofing ships, even making soap. And the Basques didn't just hunt whales, they perfected it. They developed harpoons with detachable heads and used small boats to chase their prey, techniques so effective they remained unchanged for centuries. But the real secret wasn't just how they hunted, it was where. While most Europeans still feared the open ocean, Basque whalers were venturing all the way to Newfoundland, decades before Columbus sailed west. They called these waters Terra Nova, and they guarded their routes fiercely. No maps were published, no logs shared. This wasn't just exploration, it was industrial espionage on a continental scale. Their hidden fishing grounds became Europe's first offshore oil fields, fueling an economic boom that reached from Paris to Venice. What's astonishing is how little credit they've received. Unlike kings and conquerors, the Basques left no grand monuments or chronicles. Their legacy was written in ledgers, trade records showing thousands of barrels shipped, prices negotiated, fortunes made. And yet, their impact was profound. By proving that the Atlantic wasn't just navigable but profitable, they rewrote the rules of maritime expansion. Profit, not glory, became the engine of exploration. The Basque story shatters the myth that Europe's global reach was built solely by famous names and royal sponsors. Sometimes, history's greatest leaps come from quiet pragmatism, from fishermen who saw not an ocean of monsters, but a highway to prosperity. And long before empires claimed these waters, it was the Basques who taught Europe how to harvest the sea. While daring explorers were pushing into uncharted waters, an entirely different kind of maritime revolution was unfolding closer to home, one built not on conquest but on contract. Enter the Hanseatic League, a network so vast and influential that it turned the Baltic Sea into medieval Europe's answer to a modern free trade zone. Picture dozens of bustling port cities, from Bruges to Bergen, where German merchants didn't just trade goods, they rewrote the rules of commerce itself. What made the Hanseatic League extraordinary wasn't just its scale, but its structure. This wasn't an empire or a kingdom. It was a federation of merchant guilds, bound by mutual interest rather than royal decrees. Their strength lay in collaboration, pooling resources to build lighthouses, standardize weights and measures, even maintain their own navy to protect shipping lanes. In an era of feudal fragmentation, they created something radical: a borderless economy where a trader from Lübeck could do business in London or Novgorod with the same ease as in his hometown. The cargo that crisscrossed the Baltic tells the story: salt from Lüneburg, preserved fish from Norway, Russian furs warmed nobles in Flanders, timber from Riga rebuilt cities after fires. But the League's real power lay in its control of two humble commodities, grain and herring. By dominating the flow of Baltic grain to Western Europe, they fed growing urban populations. And their mastery of salted herring, a staple food for fasting Christians, gave them leverage over entire kingdoms. When the Danish king tried to tax their ships too heavily, the League simply blockaded his ports until he backed down. Yet their influence went far beyond economics. Hanseatic outposts became cultural hubs where languages mixed, technologies spread, and ideas flowed as freely as goods. The League introduced double-entry bookkeeping to Northern Europe, revolutionized ship design with the sturdy cog vessel, and even influenced architecture, those stepped gable facades you see in old Baltic towns. That's their legacy. What's remarkable is how quietly they shaped history. Unlike flashy explorers, the Hanseatic merchants left no grand monuments, just ledgers, warehouses, and the invisible networks that still connect Europe's north today. When their power faded in the 16th century, it wasn't due to failure, but because their model had become the norm. They proved that commerce, not conquest, could be the ultimate force of connection, turning the Baltic from a frontier into the heart of a trading world. While Venice's golden galleys grabbed the spotlight in the Mediterranean, Genoa was playing a different game, one that stretched far beyond familiar waters. Their secret, the Black Sea, a crossroads of civilizations where European merchants rubbed shoulders with Mongol traders, Byzantine officials, and Turkic nomads. This wasn't just commerce, it was a high-stakes experiment in globalization, centuries before the word existed. At the heart of Genoa's network stood Caffa, a bustling Crimean port that defied expectations. Founded in the 13th century, this wasn't some makeshift trading post. Caffa boasted stone walls, churches, and even a slave market so vast it supplied laborers from Egypt to Italy. But what really set it apart was its role as a relay station for goods flowing along the Silk Road. Genoa's merchants didn't just wait for spices and silks to reach them. They sent agents deep into Mongol territory, negotiating directly with khans and caravaneers. The result, a direct pipeline for luxuries like Chinese porcelain and Persian dyes, bypassing dozens of middlemen. The real genius of this system lay in its adaptability. When the Mongol Empire fragmented, Genoa didn't retreat, it doubled down. They forged alliances with new powers like the Golden Horde, and even turned crisis into opportunity. Take the Black Death. While the plague devastated Caffa in the 14th century, Genoa's ships unwittingly carried more than just cargo. They transported rats and fleas that spread the disease to Europe. Yet even this catastrophe revealed their reach. The very network that brought death also proved how deeply interconnected the world had become. What's often overlooked is how these ventures reshaped Europe's palate, literally. Before Genoa's Black Sea trade, spices like pepper were so rare they were worth their weight in silver. But as shipments grew more regular, prices dropped, and suddenly, even middle-class households could afford flavors from halfway across the world. This wasn't just about luxury, it rewrote recipes, medicine, even fashion. Saffron-dyed fabrics became the rage in Florence and Paris, yet the trade had a darker side. The same ships carrying silk also transported slaves, often young men and women from the Caucasus or the Eurasian steppe. While this was tragically common for the era, the scale was unprecedented. At its peak, Caffa's slave markets processed thousands annually, a grim reminder that Europe's expansion came at a human cost. Genoa's story teaches us something unexpected. Sometimes the quietest traders make the loudest impact. Without fanfare or conquest, they stitched together a network that linked continental economies, proving that profit could be as powerful as any empire. And though Venice won the history books, it was Genoa's Black Sea gambit that showed Europe just how far its influence could stretch. One silk bolt, one spice sack, one ship at a time. The vast Atlantic had long been Europe's final frontier, a realm of storms and sea monsters where few dared to sail beyond sight of land. But in the early 15th century, Portuguese sailors made a discovery that would shatter those fears: the Azores. This scattered chain of volcanic islands, rising from the ocean like emerald jewels, wasn't found through some grand expedition. It was pure chance, a ship blown off course, perhaps, or a captain chasing rumors whispered in Lisbon's taverns. Yet this accidental find would become one of history's quietest revolutions. At first glance, the Azores seemed insignificant, just 9 specks of land 1,000 miles from Portugal. But their true value lay in their location, perfectly positioned as a stepping stone into the unknown. For sailors used to hugging coastlines, the islands offered something revolutionary: proof that ships could survive the open ocean. Fresh water, timber for repairs, and safe harbors turned the Azores into a medieval pit stop, a place to regroup before plunging deeper into the Atlantic. Soon, Portuguese captains were using them as a launchpad, testing how far they could push into the void. The real breakthrough came with colonization. By the 1440s, settlers were arriving, not just soldiers and nobles, but farmers, craftsmen, and even exiled criminals given a second chance. These weren't temporary camps, but thriving communities that learned to coax wheat from volcanic soil and weave cloth from local flax. The Azores became Europe's first offshore experiment, a laboratory for survival in isolation. When crops failed, they adapted. When storms wrecked ships, they rebuilt. Every lesson learned here would later prove vital in the Americas and Africa. But the island's greatest gift was psychological. Before the Azores, the Atlantic was a barrier. Afterward, it became a highway. Portuguese navigators began seeing patterns in winds and currents, realizing the ocean had rhythms they could harness. The Gulf Stream, once a feared current that dragged ships north, was now a tool to speed voyages home. With each successful round trip, the terrifying unknown shrank a little more. What's often forgotten is how the Azores reshaped Europe's diet. Settlers introduced citrus, sugarcane, and even grapes, crops that thrived in the mild climate. Soon, Azorean wine was being shipped back to Lisbon, and oranges from São Miguel became a luxury item in Flanders. This wasn't just about survival. It was Europe's first taste of transoceanic agriculture, a preview of the Columbian exchange still decades away. The Azores proved something profound: that isolation could be overcome, and that the ocean wasn't an end but a beginning. By the time Vasco da Gama rounded Africa or Columbus sailed west, Portuguese sailors had already spent generations mastering the Atlantic's secrets, all thanks to those forgotten islands that taught Europe how to navigate a world without borders. Long before the Norse set foot on Iceland or Greenland, whispers tell of another group venturing into the Atlantic's emptiness, not warriors or merchants, but men in simple wool robes, Irish monks. These were not explorers in the traditional sense. They sought neither gold nor glory, but something far more elusive, the edge of the world where solitude might bring them closer to God. Their boats were fragile things, little more than carrach's wooden frames wrapped in animal hide, yet they braved waves that would make seasoned sailors hesitate. The most famous of these monks was Saint Brendan, whose legendary 6th century voyage was preserved in a text called the Navigatio Sancti Brendani. Blurring the line between fact and fable, it describes encounters with crystal pillars rising from the sea, possibly icebergs, and islands that burst into flame, perhaps volcanic activity. For centuries, scholars dismissed it as pure myth until modern navigators proved such a journey was possible, sailing a replica carrach from Ireland to Newfoundland in the 1970s. Whether Brendan reached North America remains debated, but the deeper truth is undeniable. Irish monks were pushing westward into the unknown long before it was fashionable. What's often overlooked is why they went. This wasn't just wanderlust, it was a form of devotion. In early Christian Ireland, isolation was spiritual currency. Monks believed that the farther they journeyed from civilization, the closer they came to paradise. Some sought terra promissionis, the promised land of the saints, a heavenly realm thought to lie beyond the sunset. Others simply craved stillness, fleeing a Europe increasingly fractured by politics and war. Their voyages were pilgrimages without destinations, where the act of sailing itself was the prayer. Evidence of their presence lingers in unexpected places. Icelandic sagas mention finding Irish books, bells, and even hermits when Norse settlers arrived in the 9th century. Place names like Papi, meaning Island of the Monks, dot the Faroes and Hebrides. Even the Icelandic word for Irish, Vestmen, carries echoes of these mysterious predecessors. Yet the monks left no colonies, no grand claims of discovery. Their legacy was written in psalms scratched on vellum, not in royal decrees. The monk's story challenges our assumptions about exploration. We tend to measure historical voyages by their tangible outcomes, maps drawn, territories claimed. But for these men, the journey was the purpose. Their courage came not from the promise of reward, but from faith that the horizon held something sacred. In an age where every inch of the globe is charted and tagged, there's something haunting about their quest, a reminder that exploration can be as much about the soul as the soil beneath our feet. Perhaps that's why their legacy endures. When modern sailors retrace Brendan's route or scholars debate the authenticity of his travels, they're grappling with more than historical trivia. They're confronting a timeless question: what drives humans to face the unknown? For the Irish monks, the answer was written in the waves, not in ink, but in the quiet rhythm of oars cutting through endless blue. Venetian galleys gliding into Alexandria's harbor carried more than silks and spices. They transported human lives. While Venice is celebrated for its shimmering canals and Renaissance art, its merchants played a ruthless role in a shadowy network that stretched from the Mediterranean shores to the heart of the Arab world. The slave markets of Alexandria became a grim crossroads where Europe's hunger for profit collided with the Arab world's demand for labor, weaving a web of suffering into the fabric of global trade. At first glance, this commerce seemed almost bureaucratic. Venetian ledgers from the 14th century list people alongside bolts of cloth and barrels of pepper, itemized, priced, and taxed. Most were young women from the Black Sea region, the Caucasus, or even the Balkans, trafficked through ports like Tana on the Sea of Azov. Their journey was brutal. Captured in raids or sold by debt-ridden families, marched to coastal markets, then packed into ships' holds for the voyage south. Once in Alexandria, they were paraded before buyers from Cairo, Damascus, and beyond, their fates decided by the highest bidder. But what's chilling is how ordinary this became. Venetian officials didn't hide the trade, they regulated it. Contracts specified healthy, unblemished individuals with premiums paid for fluency in Arabic or skills like music or embroidery. The Republic even appointed special magistrates to oversee slave auctions, ensuring the state took its cut. This wasn't a clandestine operation. It was a cornerstone of Venice's economy, as routine as trading glass or salt. The trade's reach exposes uncomfortable truths. Many enslaved women ended up in elite households as domestics or concubines, while men often toiled in construction or agriculture. Some converted to Islam, blurring religious lines in ways that unsettled European clergy. Yet the system's cruelty was matched by its complexity. A few slaves gained influence, like the Armenian woman who became a power broker in Mamluk Egypt, while others languished in anonymity. Venice's role in this network reveals the dark duality of medieval expansion. The same ships that carried ideas, art, and innovation between cultures also fueled cycles of exploitation. When we admire Venetian mosaics or marvel at Marco Polo's travels, we're seeing only half the story. The other half is written in the silent ledger entries of those who bought and sold, proof that Europe's global reach was built not just on discovery, but on dispossession. This chapter doesn't fit neatly into tales of progress or cultural exchange. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. The bridges between civilizations were sometimes built on broken backs. And perhaps that's why these stories fade from history books, not because they're insignificant, but because they remind us that every age of exploration casts shadows as long as it's light. Among the lavish courts of medieval Europe, where kings and nobles commissioned portraits and tapestries, one masterpiece stood apart, not for its gold leaf or religious imagery, but for its secrets. The Catalan Atlas, crafted in 1375 by the Majorcan Jewish cartographer Abraham Cresques, wasn't meant to decorate a chapel. It was a working document, its vellum pages crammed with details so precise they could guide a merchant from Morocco to China. What makes this map extraordinary isn't just its beauty, it's the whispered knowledge it contained. Routes so valuable, they were the medieval equivalent of trade algorithms. Look closely at the Sahara depicted in the Atlas, and you'll see something astonishing, a web of thin lines snaking through the desert, each marking a caravan path known only to Tuareg nomads and the boldest traders. These weren't guesses, they were trade secrets, likely compiled from Jewish merchant networks that stretched across North Africa. The Atlas shows oases in exact locations, distances between water sources measured in days of travel. For European readers, the Sahara had been a blank space of "here be dragons" legends, but Cresques filled it with practical data: where to find salt deposits, which tribes controlled which routes, even warnings about bandits. This wasn't geography, it was corporate intelligence centuries before the term existed. Then there's the Indian Ocean, rendered with startling accuracy. While most European maps of the time showed the ocean as an impassable void, the Catalan Atlas charts monsoon winds Arab sailors had used for centuries, along with ports from Zanzibar to Sri Lanka. Some historians believe this knowledge came from Genoese traders who'd reached India decades before Vasco da Gama. Their reports funneled back through Cresques' contacts. The Atlas even hints at China's coastline, suggesting someone, possibly a Franciscan missionary, had shared details of voyages beyond the Spice Islands. What's revolutionary here is the realization that medieval Europe's world wasn't as narrow as we assume. The Atlas proves that scraps of global knowledge were circulating, hoarded by merchants and cartographers like state secrets. Consider the depiction of Mansa Musa, the Malian emperor whose pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 shocked the Mediterranean with its display of gold. Cresques paints him enthroned, holding a nugget the size of his fist, a nod to the African gold that powered European economies. This wasn't exoticism, it was financial reporting. The Atlas treated West Africa not as a land of myth, but as a key player in global trade. Yet the map also hides as much as it reveals. Some routes are deliberately distorted, likely to mislead competitors. Certain coastal details are suspiciously vague, not from ignorance but to protect lucrative monopolies. Even the lavish illustrations served a purpose, distracting casual viewers from the real treasure, the geographic intelligence woven into the artwork. Kings who commissioned such maps understood their power. When King Charles V of France received a copy, he didn't display it, he locked it away, treating it like nuclear codes. The Catalan Atlas forces us to rethink medieval exploration. We imagine brave captains sailing into the unknown, but the truth is messier. Behind every discovery were networks of informants, spies, and middlemen who'd known the routes for generations. The Atlas didn't just depict the world, it revealed how deeply connected it already was, long before textbooks claim globalization began. And in its inked coastlines and gilded cities, we see the blueprint for something even bigger. The moment Europe realized the planet was far smaller and far richer than it had ever dreamed. In the damp, salt-stained docks of 15th century Bristol, the talk wasn't of glory or conquest, it was of fish, specifically cod. This humble, flaky creature would become the unlikely engine of one of history's quietest maritime breakthroughs. While kings and explorers dreamed of spices and gold, Bristol's fishermen were after something more immediate, food that could feed a growing nation and line their own pockets. And in that practical pursuit, they may have beaten even John Cabot to the shores of Newfoundland by decades. The evidence lies in customs records and sailors' tales, fragments that hint at something extraordinary. As early as the 1470s, 20 years before Cabot's famed voyage of 1497, Bristol ships were returning with strange reports. They spoke of waters so thick with cod that baskets lowered overboard came up overflowing. These weren't the overfished grounds off Iceland, where European fleets clashed over dwindling stocks. These were new territories, rich and untouched. The fishermen called it simply the Newfound Land, a phrase that would later grace maps as Newfoundland. What's fascinating is how little fanfare surrounded these voyages. Unlike royal-sponsored expeditions, there were no chroniclers aboard to document the moment. No flags were planted, no territories claimed. These were working-class men focused on the haul, not history. Their ships, sturdy but unremarkable vessels called doggers, were designed for utility, not endurance. Yet their knowledge of currents and weather patterns was unmatched. They'd learned to navigate by the color of the water, the flight of seabirds, the smell of the wind. And when they stumbled upon the Grand Banks, the richest fishing grounds on earth, they kept it quiet. This was tradecraft, not exploration. The real proof comes from an unexpected source: royal pardons. In 1480, King Edward IV issued a blanket pardon to Bristol sailors for unlicensed voyages. Why pardon men for fishing? Historians suspect it was cover for something bolder ventures so far west they violated treaties with Denmark and Portugal, who controlled northern Atlantic waters. The fishermen weren't just breaking fishing quotas, they were trespassing on what would later be recognized as North America. Yet their legacy isn't just about who got there first. It's about why they went. While Columbus and Cabot chased fame and fortune, the Bristol men were solving a mundane crisis. Europe's demand for protein was exploding. Cod, salted and dried, could last for years, feeding armies, navies, and fasting Christians. The fishermen weren't just filling nets, they were stabilizing food supplies across a continent. And in doing so, they proved something revolutionary: that ordinary people, driven by everyday needs, could expand Europe's horizons as surely as any crown-funded adventurer. The irony: their discovery was so valuable that it had to stay hidden. When Cabot finally discovered Newfoundland in 1497, he reported back that the sea was swarming with fish, which can be taken not only with nets but with baskets let down with a stone. The description matched Bristol fishermen's accounts word for word. Had the secret been out all along? Perhaps that's the real lesson here. History remembers the names of kings and explorers, but often forgets the practical minds who shaped the world just as profoundly. The Bristol fishermen didn't need monuments or maps. Their legacy was written in the holds of 1,000 ships, in the meals of millions, and in the quiet certainty that sometimes the most world-changing journeys begin not with a quest for glory, but for dinner. When the Danish fleet appeared off Estonia's coast in 1219, it wasn't just an army arriving, it was an entire political and economic system sailing into view. Unlike the chaotic raids of earlier Viking expeditions, this was a meticulously planned operation. backed by papal approval, and time to exploit divisions among Estonian tribes. King Valdemar II didn't just want to convert pagans. He aimed to carve out a Danish-controlled corridor along the Baltic's eastern edge, turning the sea into a Scandinavian lake. The campaign's centerpiece was the Battle of Linderness, where legend claims Denmark's flag, the Dannebrog, fell from the sky as divine approval. Whether miracle or myth, the symbolism was potent. This wasn't just war, it was holy conquest wrapped in national identity. But what happened next reveals the real strategy. Instead of looting and leaving, the Danes built. Stone fortresses rose at Tallinn and Narva, not as temporary strongholds but as permanent trading hubs. Roads were laid to connect these ports to inland resources, amber, timber, and the Baltic's most coveted commodity, wax. Church spires soon towered over pagan shrines, but the real transformation was economic. Danish coins began circulating where barter had dominated, tying Estonia into Europe's financial networks. The Crusaders' secret weapon, adaptation. They quickly realized that brute force alone wouldn't hold the territory, so they co-opted local elites, offering Estonian chieftains titles and trade privileges in exchange for loyalty. Some converts even joined the Danish nobility, their sons sent to Copenhagen for education. This wasn't just colonization, it was assimilation in both directions. Danish administrators adopted Estonian place names, while Estonians learned to brew beer the Danish way. The fusion created a unique Baltic-Danish culture that endured long after political control shifted. Trade routes tell the deeper story. Danish-controlled Raval, modern Tallinn, became the hinge between East and West. Hanseatic merchants shipped Flemish cloth and Rhine wine eastward, while Russian furs and Persian silks flowed the other way. The Crusaders had unwittingly built a medieval version of a free trade zone where commerce mattered more than creed. Even during conflicts with the Teutonic Knights or Swedish rivals, merchants from both sides kept goods moving. Profit, it seemed, could be holier than war. What's often overlooked is how this crusade reshaped Denmark itself. The flood of Estonian grain stabilized Danish food supplies, while Baltic timber rebuilt Copenhagen after fires. The crown's new wealth funded Gothic cathedrals and the earliest Danish law codes. In a twist of irony, a war fought for religious purity ended up making Denmark more cosmopolitan. Estonian words crept into Danish dialects, and Baltic-style smoked fish became a staple in Scandinavian markets. The Danish Crusade proves that medieval expansion wasn't just about swords or souls, it was about systems. By combining military might with economic incentives and cultural flexibility, Denmark turned a holy war into something far more lasting. A blueprint for how small kingdoms could project power far beyond their shores. And though the Dannebrog no longer flies over Tallinn, its legacy lingers in the cobbled streets and trading houses that still whisper of the time when the Baltic became, for a brief but brilliant moment, a Danish sea. While kings and empires jostled for control of Europe's great rivers, a group of traders from the marshy coasts of Frisia were quietly rewriting the rules of medieval commerce. Picture their ships, low, flat-bottomed barges called cogs, gliding effortlessly where deeper vessels dared not go. These weren't the grand cogs of the Hanseatic League, laden with Baltic grain, but nimble workhorses designed for the shallow inlets and winding tributaries that crisscrossed the North Sea's edges. The Frisians didn't conquer, they connected, stitching together a trade network that ran from Viking Dublin to the vineyards of the Rhine without a single fortress or crown decree. What made their system revolutionary was its simplicity. While other merchants relied on armed convoys or royal charters, the Frisians operated on trust and reputation. Their trade fairs at places like Deventer and Medemblik became neutral ground where Norse fur traders could barter with Frankish wine merchants, their transactions sealed with handshakes rather than swords. No single commodity dominated their exchanges. Instead, they dealt in everything: slabs of Rhineland basalt for church foundations, Frisian wool cloaks prized in Norway, even live eels transported in water-filled barrels to satisfy Scandinavian appetites. This was globalization at its most grassroots, proving that commerce didn't need empires to thrive. The secret to their success lay in geography. Frisia's maze of wetlands made it nearly immune to invasion. Even Charlemagne struggled to subdue the region, but its waterways formed a natural highway between worlds. A Frisian trader could load his cog with amber from Jutland, sail south to the Rhine Delta, then follow the river deep into Francia, swapping goods at every stop. Their ships became floating markets with crews who spoke half a dozen languages and understood local customs from Brittany to Berka. Archaeology reveals how far their influence reached. Excavations in London uncovered Frisian-style brooches alongside Arabic coins, while Frisian pottery shards turn up as far east as Novgorod. But their most enduring legacy was intangible: the concept of neutral trade zones. When the Hanseatic League later rose to power, they copied Frisian models: the idea that commerce could flow across political borders, governed by mutual interest rather than force. Yet history nearly erased them. Unlike the Hanseatic League, the Frisians left no grand warehouses or guild halls. Their records were kept on perishable wax tablets, their settlements built on land constantly reclaimed by the sea. Even their name faded, absorbed into the territories of stronger neighbors. But for a few crucial centuries, these marsh-dwelling traders did something extraordinary. They proved that the smallest players could build the widest bridges, turning Europe's waterways into threads of a single shimmering web. The first Castilian ships to reach the Canary Islands in the early 14th century didn't come bearing crosses or treaties. They came with swords and chains. These weren't state-sponsored conquests but rogue operations, led by adventurers like Lancelotto Malosolo, whose name still lingers on Lanzarote Island. What began as sporadic raids soon escalated into a brutal testing ground, where European ambitions collided with the indigenous Guanche people in a preview of the colonial violence that would reshape the globe. At first glance, the Canaries seemed an unlikely prize: volcanic rocks jutting from the Atlantic, hundreds of miles from mainland Europe. But their strategic value was undeniable. Positioned along the trade winds that would later carry Columbus to the Americas, the islands offered a crucial waypoint for ships venturing south along Africa's coast. More immediately, they held something medieval Europe craved: slaves. The Guanches, a Berber-descended people who had lived in isolation for over 1,000 years, became targets. Castilian raiders stormed beaches under cover of darkness, snatching men, women, and children to sell in Seville's markets. Contemporary records describe Guanche captives as tall, strong, and wild, fetching premium prices as domestic servants or agricultural laborers. What made these raids particularly sinister was their improvisational nature. Unlike later colonial ventures backed by crowns and popes, the Canary attacks were often freelance operations. Ship captains would pool resources for an expedition, then split the human cargo upon return. Church officials turned a blind eye, rationalizing the enslavement of non-Christians. Even the terminology was fluid. Raiders called themselves rescate, a euphemism meaning ransom, suggesting the Guanches were being saved through forced labor. The line between piracy and state-sanctioned expansion blurred beyond recognition. Yet the Guanches didn't go quietly. On Gran Canaria and Tenerife, they used their knowledge of steep ravines and volcanic caves to wage guerrilla warfare. One account describes how warriors rolled boulders onto invading forces, crushing armored knights in narrow passes. Others poisoned water sources or launched nighttime counter-raids to free captured kin. For decades, the islands became a deadly chessboard where European weaponry clashed with indigenous tactics. The real significance of this struggle wasn't just territorial, it was logistical. The Canaries forced Europeans to solve problems they'd soon face across the Atlantic: how to supply armies months from home, how to subdue populations without wholesale slaughter, which would destroy the labor pool, and how to justify conquest to skeptical monarchs. When Castile finally launched full-scale invasions in the early 15th century, they brought priests alongside soldiers, offering conversion as an alternative to enslavement. It was a template for the Spanish Empire's later spiritual conquest in the Americas. By the time the last Guanche stronghold fell in 1496, the Canaries had already transformed. Sugarcane plantations, worked by enslaved Africans after the Guanches dwindled, turned the islands into Europe's first overseas cash crop economy. The same model would soon replant itself in the Caribbean. And those violent early raids, they proved something disturbing but essential: that Europe could project power across oceanic distances, and that profit would always find a way to outweigh conscience. The Canaries weren't just a stepping stone, they were a dark rehearsal for everything that followed. Scotland's rugged coastline might seem like the edge of the medieval world, but its kings saw something different: a gateway. When 12-year-old King Alexander III married Margaret of Norway in 1261, the ceremony wasn't just about politics. It was a masterstroke of maritime strategy, linking Scotland's ports to Norway's vast northern sea lanes. Overnight, Scottish merchants gained access to routes stretching from Bergen to the Arctic Circle, turning what had been a peripheral kingdom into a player in Europe's oceanic chessboard. The real prize was the Nordavegar, the ancient sea road along Norway's coast. For centuries, this icy highway had been dominated by Norse traders hauling stockfish, walrus ivory, and Russian furs south to Bergen. Now, Scottish ships could join the flow. Records from Bergen's trading post show Gaelic names alongside Norse ones, with Scottish merchants bartering wool and salt for goods that would later appear on tables from Paris to Novgorod. But this wasn't just about goods, it was about knowledge. Scottish sailors learned to navigate the same treacherous currents and fjords that had made Viking legends, adopting Norse techniques like using polar stars for orientation in the endless summer daylight of the Arctic Circle. What's often overlooked is how this alliance reshaped Scotland itself. Suddenly, towns like Aberdeen and Inverness buzzed with new energy. Shipbuilders began crafting hybrid vessels, combining Norse keel designs with Scottish oak, better suited for both North Sea gales and coastal trading. The influx of Norwegian timber solved a chronic shortage, allowing Scotland to expand its fleet without relying on English or Baltic suppliers. Even the language changed, with nautical terms like kist chest and nar, a type of cargo ship, slipping into Scots dialects. The human connections ran deeper than ledgers. Norwegian wives of Scottish merchants introduced dried fish techniques that revolutionized food preservation, while Scottish clerics brought back tales of Greenland's Norse settlements from Bergen sailors. These weren't just trade partners, they were kin. When the Norwegian king died without an heir in 1314, Scotland's Robert the Bruce saw an opportunity not for conquest, but for consolidation. His famous Sea King letter proposed unifying the kingdoms under shared maritime interests, a vision centuries ahead of its time. Yet the alliance's greatest legacy was invisible: a mindset shift. Before the Norwegian connection, Scotland's gaze had been landward, locked in border struggles with England. Afterward, its rulers thought in terms of tides and trade winds. When James IV later built the Great Michael, Europe's largest warship, he was following a blueprint laid down 2 centuries earlier that a small nation could wield outsized power by mastering the sea. The irony, while the political union eventually frayed, the sea routes endured. Even after Norway fell under Danish control, Scottish merchants kept sailing north, their ships laden with goods that belied their island size. In Bergen's Briggan Wharf, the Scottish enclave remained for generations, a testament to what diplomacy and daring could achieve. No crowns were exchanged, no empires built, just a quiet web of connections that proved sometimes the most lasting conquests happen without a single drop of blood spilled. Pisa's merchants didn't just navigate the Mediterranean, they cracked it open like a vault. While Venice and Genoa battled for dominance over the eastern trade routes, Pisa took a different gamble south. Their ships, smaller but swifter, became a common sight along the North African coast, slipping into ports like Tunis and Modia long before other Europeans dared. What they found there wasn't just exotic goods, it was an entire economic ecosystem waiting to be tapped, one that would quietly reshape Europe's understanding of Africa's riches. The key to Pisa's success lay in its pragmatism. Unlike other Italian city-states that demanded concessions or conquest, Pisan traders operated on a simple principle: adapt or fail. They learned enough Arabic to negotiate directly with local rulers, adopted lightweight North African textiles for sails that caught the wind better than heavy European canvas, and even embraced Islamic banking practices like credit notes to avoid carrying chests of coins through bandit-filled hinterlands. Their ledgers from the 12th century read like a treasure map: gold dust from the Sahel traded for Tuscan wool, ivory from Mali swapped for Pisan-made arms, even exotic animals like cheetahs shipped north as curiosities for noble menageries. But the real prize was knowledge. Pisan captains returned with something more valuable than cargo: detailed accounts of trans-Saharan caravan routes. These weren't vague travelers' tales, but precise records where to find water in the desert, which Berber tribes controlled which oases, even the going rates for slaves at markets in Sijilmasa. One surviving document, the Pisan Merchant's Handbook, describes crossing the Sahara with such accuracy that historians suspect the author must have joined a caravan himself. This intelligence gave Pisa an edge, allowing their traders to intercept goods before they reached Mediterranean ports, cutting out layers of middlemen. The cultural exchange ran both ways. North African geographers began mentioning Pisa as a destination for Andalusian exiles, while Pisan churches started featuring Arabic-style arches and decorative motifs. In one bizarre twist, a Pisan merchant family, the Delagnellos, even briefly ruled Tunis in the late 12th century through a combination of loans and political maneuvering. Their reign was short-lived but symbolic, proof that commerce could blur the lines between continents faster than any crusade. Yet Pisa's greatest legacy was accidental. By funneling African gold into Europe, they helped alleviate a chronic currency shortage that had plagued the continent for centuries. Suddenly, mints from Florence to London had enough bullion to strike reliable coins, greasing the wheels of commerce across feudal Europe. And those tales of Timbuktu's wealth and the Niger's golden waters, they didn't just fill Pisan coffers, they planted the seeds for future Portuguese expeditions down Africa's coast, turning merchant gossip into national policy. The irony is poignant. While Pisa's maritime power eventually waned under Genoa's pressure, its African ventures proved something revolutionary: that Europe's expansion wasn't always about brute force or religious zeal. Sometimes it was just a matter of showing up, ledger in hand, ready to do business. And in the quiet deals struck between Pisan traders and Saharan merchants, we see the unheralded beginnings of a connected world, one where profit, not conquest, could be the bridge between civilizations. The Teutonic knights wore white cloaks emblazoned with black crosses, but their true power wasn't just in their swords, it was in their ships. While history remembers them as armored crusaders storming pagan strongholds across Prussia and Livonia, their secret weapon was a fleet that turned the Baltic into their private highway. Picture this: towering war cogs flying the Order's banner, escorting supply convoys from Lubeck to Riga, their decks crammed with German settlers, church bells, and barrels of salted herring. Without these ships, the knights' entire crusader state would have collapsed like a castle built on sand. What made their maritime strategy so effective was its ruthless practicality. Unlike Mediterranean powers fixated on galleys for battle, the Teutonic knights focused on cargo capacity. Their ships were floating fortresses, broad-beamed to carry hundreds of tons of grain, timber, and amber, the lifeblood of their colonies. When Lithuanian raiders burned crops inland, the knights simply imported more from Germany. When rebellions erupted, reinforcements arrived by sea within weeks. Their naval network became so reliable that merchants paid premium fees to sail under Teutonic protection, knowing pirate-filled waters suddenly became safe passage. The knights didn't just transport goods, they weaponized trade. By controlling key ports like Danzig and Memel, they could choke off rivals' access to the Baltic's riches. Swedish kings wanting Russian furs, they needed Teutonic approval. Hanseatic merchants seeking Prussian grain, the knights set the tariffs. Even the Pope relied on their ships to transport Crusade taxes back to Rome. Their maritime dominance reached its peak in the 14th century, when the Order's Grand Master could summon a fleet larger than some kingdoms' entire navies with a single command. Yet their greatest innovation was invisible, a logistical web stretching from the North Sea to the Russian frontier. The knights built a chain of fortified harbors, each a day's sail apart, where ships could resupply and repair. They maintained detailed nautical charts, closely guarded secrets, marking submerged rocks and seasonal currents. Some historians argue their courier system, with ships shuttling messages between castles, was medieval Europe's fastest communication network outside the papal couriers. This maritime empire had a dark side. The same ships that carried settlers east also transported slaves, captured Lithuanians and Prussians sold in Scandinavian markets. When the knights needed funds, they turned to outright piracy, seizing vessels from Novgorod or Denmark under thin pretexts. At their height, they functioned less as holy warriors and more as a hybrid of navy, trading company, and protection racket. The lesson here is stark. The Teutonic knights' land conquests get the glory, but it was their unsung fleet that made those victories possible. Their story proves that in the medieval world, real power didn't always ride on horseback, sometimes it sailed on the tide. And when their naval dominance finally waned in the 15th century, their crusader state crumbled just as quickly as it had risen. A reminder that even the mightiest empires are only as strong as the ships that sustain them. The Mediterranean sun glittered on the waves like scattered coins, but beneath its beauty lurked a terror that kept coastal villagers awake at night, the sleek, shallow-drafted galleys of Moorish Corsairs slicing through the water. These weren't random raiders. They were highly organized privateers operating from bases in Al-Andalus and North Africa, turning Europe's southern shores into a hunting ground. Their tactics were brutally efficient. Fast ships would strike without warning, snatching fishermen from their boats, emptying entire villages, and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. One particularly audacious raid in 985 saw pirates sack Barcelona itself, carrying off thousands of captives to be sold in Cordoba's slave markets. What made these raids so devastating wasn't just their violence, it was their psychological impact. For generations, coastal communities lived in constant dread, building churches on hilltops to double as lookout posts. Bells that once called worshippers to prayer now told warnings of approaching sails. In response, Christian kingdoms began investing in something previously neglected: naval defense. The old Roman watchtowers dotting the Spanish coast were repaired and expanded into a network of fortified torres de vigor, their fires signaling danger from Valencia to Gibraltar. Shipwrights experimented with new designs, crafting vessels like the turreter, a hybrid galley with higher sides to repel boarders and reinforced holds to carry troops. The Corsairs' influence went deeper than military adaptation. Their relentless pressure forced Europeans to rethink trade. Merchant ships began sailing in convoy, a practice later adopted by Venice and Genoa. Insurance contracts from 12th century Pisa show clauses specifically covering Moorish piracy, proving how routine the threat had become. Even language bears their mark. The English word arsenal comes from the Arabic dar al-Sinna, reflecting how much naval technology Europe borrowed from its adversaries. Yet the most surprising legacy of these raids was cultural. Captives who escaped or were ransomed brought back knowledge that filtered into European society. A monk from Marseille, held in Almeria for a decade, returned with Arabic translations of Greek texts on mathematics, which he used to rebuild his monastery's library. Others learned improved navigation techniques, like using the camel to measure latitude, skills that would later aid European explorers. The Corsairs intended to weaken Christendom, but their unintended gift was the very knowledge that would one day help Europe surpass them. This wasn't just a clash of religions, it was an arms race. By the 14th century, the Kingdom of Aragon had established the Cofradia de la Mar, a proto-navy funded by merchants to patrol shipping lanes. Their success proved that defense could be profitable. Captured pirate ships were auctioned off, their crews ransomed or enslaved in turn. The cycle of raid and counter-raid sharpened both sides, refining ship design, naval tactics, and even international law. When Columbus set sail in 1492, his ships carried centuries of hard-won maritime knowledge forged in the fire of Mediterranean conflict. The Moorish Corsairs meant to keep Europe cowed, but instead they helped build the tools that would eventually eclipse their own dominance. The wool trade between England and Flanders didn't just fill merchant ledgers, it rewrote the rules of medieval shipping. Picture the English countryside in the 12th century, where sheep outnumbered people 3 to 1, their fleeces so prized that Flemish weavers called them white gold. But getting this treasure across the treacherous English Channel required more than just sturdy sacks. It demanded ships capable of braving winter gales, outrunning pirates, and docking in shallow Flemish harbors where deeper vessels ran aground. The solution, a quiet revolution in ship design that would lay the groundwork for Europe's age of exploration. At the heart of this transformation was the humble cog, a stout, round-hulled vessel with a single square sail. Earlier versions had plied northern waters for centuries, but the wool trade forced rapid upgrades. Shipwrights added sternpost rudders for better control, crucial when navigating the channel's shifting currents. They expanded cargo holds to accommodate bulky wool bales, while raised castles fore and aft gave archers vantage points against pirates. These adaptations didn't come from royal decrees or military engineers. They emerged from the pragmatic demands of merchants who needed their goods delivered intact. A single voyage could carry wool worth a king's ransom, and sunken ships meant ruined fortunes. The trade scale was staggering. Customs records from the port of Boston show over 5,000 sacks of wool shipped annually to Flanders at its peak, each sack containing enough fleece to make 25 heavy cloaks. This wasn't just bulk transport, it was precision logistics. Flemish buyers graded wool by texture and color, requiring ships to keep batches separate. Some merchants even began labeling bales with marks akin to modern barcodes, early branding in a trade where reputation meant everything. But the real innovation was financial. With so much wealth afloat, traditional barter systems collapsed under the weight. Italian bankers in Bruges introduced bills of exchange, allowing English wool growers to be paid in silver before their shipments even left London. Insurance contracts appeared, covering risks from storms to piracy. The wool trade became Europe's first truly modern industry, its tentacles stretching from Yorkshire sheepfolds to Florentine counting houses. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was invisible knowledge. Season after season, Channel sailors refined their understanding of tides and weather patterns. Their Rutter's handwritten navigational guides began including depth soundings for Flemish ports and landmarks for coastal piloting. These weren't just notes, they were the first drafts of a maritime atlas, compiled by men for whom a wrong turn meant financial ruin. When later explorers like Cabot set sail for distant lands, they relied on skills honed by generations of wool merchants. The Flemish trade's decline in the 14th century, spurred by wars and shifting markets, couldn't erase its impact. The ships, the maps, the financial tools it spawned didn't vanish. They were repurposed. Those same cogs that once carried wool would soon carry colonists to Iceland, crusaders to Prussia, and explorers down the African coast. What began as a quest for softer fabric ended up weaving the very fabric of Europe's maritime future, one sturdy, wool-filled hull at a time. Ragusa's harbor might have been small, but its ambitions stretched across continents. While Venice flaunted its golden galleys and Genoa boasted of Black Sea monopolies, this independent city-state perched on the rugged Dalmatian coast quietly built one of the most agile merchant fleets of the medieval Mediterranean. What Ragusa lacked in size, it made up for in sheer strategic brilliance. Its ships, sleek and fast, became the Swiss watchmakers of maritime trade, precision instruments designed to slip between the cracks of empires. The secret to Ragusa's success, neutrality with teeth, sandwiched between Venice's naval might and the Ottoman Empire's expanding reach, the city's leaders mastered a delicate dance of diplomacy. They paid tribute to the Sultan while signing trade pacts with Christian kingdoms, ensuring their vessels flew under everyone's radar and everyone's protection. A Ragusan ship could dock in Constantinople one month and Barcelona the next, its cargo hold swapping Ottoman silks for Spanish wool without a single drawn sword. This wasn't just business, it was geopolitical judo, using rivals' weight against them. Their fleet's design reflected this nimble philosophy. Ragusan mariners favored the Grippo, a hybrid vessel combining Venetian speed with Arabic cargo capacity. Unlike the heavy cogs of northern Europe, these ships could outrun pirates in open water, yet navigate shallow Aegean coves where larger galleys ran aground. Sailors joked that a Ragusan captain could thread a needle with his ship, and the ledgers prove it. Customs records from Alexandria show Ragusan merchants delivering Bulgarian wax to Mamluk Egypt, then returning with Indian spices via Ottoman middlemen, all while avoiding Venetian tariffs entirely. But their real genius lay in information networks. Ragusa's consuls, part spies, part accountants, were planted in every major port from Seville to Trebizond. They tracked grain shortages before harvests failed, anticipated sultans' whims through palace gossip, and relayed everything via fast courier ships. When the Ottomans banned European traders from the Black Sea in 1453, Ragusan merchants had already repositioned their assets, thanks to a whispered warning from their man in Edirne. This wasn't just trade, it was high-stakes intelligence work, where knowing who needed linen before they asked meant the difference between profit and ruin. The city's legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern insurance contracts trace their roots to Ragusan, loans for sea risk, where investors shared profits in exchange for covering losses. Their maritime code, the Liber Statutarum, became a model for balancing crew rights with merchant interests. Even the famous argosies of Shakespeare's plays, those proverbial treasure ships, were named after Ragusa's vessels, their reputation for reliability etched into literary history. Yet perhaps the most telling detail lies in Ragusa's nickname, the Serbian Venice. It's a misnomer that captures their triumph. They weren't Serbian nor Venetian, just Ragusan. And in a world of empires, that was enough. Their story proves that maritime power wasn't always about who had the biggest fleet, but who knew how to sail the winds of change. While Venice fought costly wars to maintain its dominance, Ragusa thrived by making itself indispensable to everyone and beholden to no one. While most of Europe clung to coastal routes like children clutching their mothers' skirts, Breton sailors were dancing across the open Atlantic with a fearlessness that defied medieval logic. These weren't the grand expeditions of kings or the holy missions of monks, just weathered fishermen and traders from Brittany's rocky shores, whose Celtic ancestors had whispered secrets of the ocean for generations. Their ships, sturdy bisquines with distinctive red sails, became a common sight from the Irish Sea to the Iberian Peninsula, but their real legacy lay in the routes they pioneered far beyond sight of land. What set the Bretons apart was their intimate dialogue with the sea. Unlike Mediterranean navigators who relied on landmarks, they read the Atlantic like a familiar story, the taste of the water indicating proximity to river mouths, the flight patterns of seabirds hinting at distant shores. Their greatest trick, mastering the Gulf Stream centuries before it had a name. Breton fishermen chasing cod off Newfoundland learned to ride this liquid highway westward, then catch its southern flow for the return trip. These weren't accidents, they were calculated maneuvers passed down through songs and star lore, a living library of oceanic knowledge. The proof lies in the destinations they reached while others hesitated. Breton ships were regular visitors to the Canary Islands by the early 14th century, not as conquerors but as traders bartering iron tools for orchil dye with the Guanches. Some even pushed further. Medieval Portuguese chronicles speak of Breton vessels sighting the Azores before official discovery, their crews keeping the locations secret to protect prime fishing grounds. Their reputation grew so legendary that when Christopher Columbus planned his westward voyage, he sought out Breton sailors in Galicia to cross-examine their accounts of strange driftwood and unusual currents. Yet their brilliance was in adaptation, not conquest. Where others saw barriers, Bretons saw opportunities. When the Hanseatic League monopolized Baltic trade, they simply sailed around it, establishing direct wool exchanges between Ireland and Flanders. When the 100 Years' War choked French ports, they became neutral carriers for both sides, their ships flying makeshift flags that changed with the political winds. This wasn't just navigation, it was geopolitical chess played from the crow's nest. The most poignant testament to their skill is written not in chronicles, but in genetics. Modern DNA studies show Breton markers among the founding populations of the Faroe Islands and Newfoundland, suggesting some of these sailors didn't just visit, they stayed. Their legacy lingers in the Breton bagpipes played in Canadian fishing villages, in the Celtic cross gravestones found on distant shores, and most of all, in the unshakable truth that Europe's maritime expansion wasn't always about empires and armies. Sometimes it was just about men who knew the sea's language better than their own and dared to follow where it led. The Swedish Vikings who sliced through Russian rivers weren't just after plunder, they were architects of the medieval world's most unlikely superhighway. Picture their longships not cutting through open seas but gliding down the Volkhov and Dnieper, their hulls riding so shallow they could navigate waters barely 3 feet deep. These weren't raids, they were supply chains in motion, with Swedish traders called Varangians by the Byzantines ferrying amber from the Baltic to Constantinople and returning with silk that would eventually dress Scandinavian elites. The real marvel wasn't the goods exchanged, but the system they built, a riverine network so efficient it turned the wilds of Rus into Europe's backdoor to the east. At the heart of this operation lay 2 choke points, Novgorod and Kiev. Novgorod, with its labyrinth of rivers, became the northern hub where Swedish iron met Russian furs. Kiev, strategically perched above the Dnieper's rapids, evolved into a customs checkpoint where Varangian crews paid Slavic tribes for safe passage. The arrangement was brutally practical. Swedes provided security against steppe nomads. Locals supplied guides who knew every sandbar and whirlpool, and both split the profits. Byzantine records describe how these partnerships scaled. A single Varangian flotilla in 907 reportedly carried over 5,000 men and their cargo, a floating marketplace that took days to fully pass through Constantinople's gates. The Varangians' secret weapon was adaptation. Unlike their cousins who terrorized Paris and York, these Vikings quickly shed their raiding habits. They adopted Slavic rivercraft for sections too treacherous for longships, learned to portage vessels overland between watersheds, and even took local wives. Archaeology reveals Swedish-style brooches in Slavic graves and Slavic pottery in Swedish trading posts. By the 10th century, many so-called Varangians were actually second-generation immigrants, their identities as fluid as the rivers they plied. Their cultural footprint was profound. The Rus, originally a Finnish term for Swedish rowers, lent their name to Russia itself. Varangian bodyguards became prized assets for Byzantine emperors, their axe-wielding prowess immortalized in mosaics at Hagia Sophia. But their greatest legacy was invisible. The routes they established became the skeleton of the medieval global economy. Arabic silver dirhams unearthed in Sweden traveled those waterways, as did Chinese lacquerware found in Viking Dublin. When a Varangian named Ingvar the Far-Traveled led an ill-fated expedition to the Caspian in the 1100s, his runestones back home didn't boast of battles. They mourned men who died in the east with Ingvar seeking gold. What makes their story extraordinary isn't just the distances covered, but the barriers erased. The Varangians proved that rivers could be more than boundaries. They were threads stitching together worlds that barely knew each other existed. And long after their trading posts faded, the routes they carved would endure, whispering to later generations that the real treasure wasn't in the silk or silver, but in the connections forged between people who chose commerce over conquest. The Normans storming Sicily in the 11th century didn't arrive on horseback, they came by ship, and that made all the difference. While history remembers them as fierce knights clad in chainmail, their true edge lay in something far more strategic, a navy cobbled together from unlikely allies. Picture this: former Viking descendants, now French-speaking warlords, commanding fleets of repurposed Byzantine dromons and Arab shalandi, their decks crowded with mercenaries from Calabria and Amalfi. This wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a masterclass in maritime improvisation, where control of the waves decided who ruled the land, what made Sicily the ultimate prize. Geography: the island sat like a stepping stone in the Mediterranean, its ports offering refuge to ships traveling between Europe, Africa, and the Levant. For the Normans, seizing it wasn't about adding another province, it was about holding the turnstile of global trade. Their genius lay in recognizing that conquest required more than siege engines, it needed harbors. When Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger launched their campaign in 1061, their first targets weren't castles but docks. Messina fell not because its walls were weak, but because Norman ships cut off grain shipments, starving the city into submission. The real surprise was their adaptability. Norman admirals, many of them local Sicilian Greeks or exiled Arab captains, blended tactics from every culture they encountered. They used Byzantine fire projectiles to scatter Fatimid patrols, then deployed nimble Ligurian pirate vessels to raid coastal supply lines. By the time Palermo capitulated in 1072, the Normans had done something unprecedented, forged a hybrid fleet that could outmaneuver both Christian and Muslim rivals. Their secret delegation. Instead of imposing foreign rule, they promoted Sicilian admirals like Christodulus, a former Greek rebel, who turned the island's navy into the Mediterranean's most feared force. Sicily under the Normans became a blueprint for maritime empire. Their capital, Palermo, thrived as a trilingual hub where Arab geographers, Jewish merchants, and Lombard sailors collaborated on maps more accurate than anything in Europe. The royal fleet, staffed by Arab shipwrights and Norman officers, patrolled waters from Tunis to Greece, ensuring safe passage for the silks and spices that enriched their coffers. Even their bureaucracy was revolutionary. Tax records from 1180 showed tariffs calculated based on wind patterns, with lower rates for ships battling headwinds. Yet their greatest legacy was invisible. By proving that naval power could sustain a multicultural kingdom, the Normans shattered the myth that medieval empires had to be landlocked monoliths. When Frederick II, their famed descendant, later launched the Sixth Crusade from Sicilian docks, he didn't just retake Jerusalem. He proved that the future of power lay not in castles, but in the hands of those who commanded the sea. The Normans didn't just conquer Sicily, they revealed the playbook for how Europe would dominate the Mediterranean for centuries to come. The icy waters between Bergen and Iceland were no place for the faint-hearted, yet Hanseatic cogs made the journey every summer without fail. These weren't the grand expeditions of kings or explorers, just pragmatic merchants hauling barrels of grain, German beer, and Flemish cloth to an island so remote that medieval maps often placed it at the world's edge. What made Iceland worth the risk? Stockfish. The wind-dried cod harvested by Icelandic fishermen became one of Europe's most sought-after commodities, a protein-rich staple that could last for years without spoiling. In exchange, Hanseatic traders brought the one thing Iceland couldn't produce itself: timber. Every plank, every barrel stave, every ship's mast had to be imported, turning the League's vessels into floating lifelines for a society perpetually on the brink of scarcity. The real marvel wasn't the trade itself, but the system that sustained it. Hanseatic ships operated like clockwork, arriving with the spring thaw and departing before the autumn storms. They established a trading post at Bessastaðir, near modern-day Reykjavik, where goods were exchanged under strict rules. No credit, no bartering, just hard silver counted out on weighted scales. Icelandic sagas describe the annual market as a spectacle. German merchants in woolen tunics haggling over fish, while their crews repaired ships with driftwood salvaged from Greenland's distant shores. For isolated Icelandic farmers, these summer visits were their only window to the wider world, bringing news of wars, plagues, and even the latest fashions from Bruges or Lübeck. But the League's influence went deeper than commerce. Their presence subtly shifted Iceland's economic DNA. Traditional Viking-era trade, based on personal ties and gift exchanges, gave way to a cash economy. Hanseatic ledgers from Bergen reveal how Icelanders began specializing. Entire farms pivoted from sheepherding to fishing, knowing their catch could now reliably be converted into grain or iron tools. The change wasn't always peaceful. When English merchants tried to muscle in on the trade in the 15th century, the Hanseatic response was ruthless. Their warships blockaded Icelandic harbors until the King of Norway, their nominal overlord, granted them exclusive rights. The cultural exchange ran both ways. Hanseatic traders adopted Icelandic techniques for preserving fish in Arctic conditions, methods that later fueled the North Sea's herring boom. Meanwhile, German-style brick architecture appeared in Icelandic churches, and Low German loanwords seeped into the local dialect terms like krambað from krambud, meaning a small shop, still linger in modern Icelandic. Even the island's famous wool sweaters, with their distinctive circular yokes, may have been influenced by Baltic knitting patterns introduced through trade. What makes this chapter extraordinary is its quiet defiance of geography. The Hanseatic League didn't just connect cities, it bound together places that logic said should remain isolated. Their ships turned Iceland from a Norse relic into a node in a network stretching from Novgorod's fur markets to London's wool exchanges. And when the Black Death wiped out nearly half of Norway's population in 1349, it was Hanseatic cogs that kept Iceland supplied, proving that even at the edge of the known world, no island was truly alone as long as the promise of profit could bridge the waves. Venetian shipwrights shaping the ribs of a war galley rarely glanced up at the timber's origin, but every beam told a story. The oak that framed La Serenissimi's mighty fleet didn't come from Italy's exhausted forests. It sailed across the Adriatic from Albania's rugged highlands, where ancient trees grew straight and tall, their wood dense enough to withstand cannon fire. This unheralded trade in timber was more than commerce. It was the invisible foundation of Venetian naval dominance, a lifeline stretching from Albanian sawpits to the arsenal's bustling docks. Albania's value lay in its geography. The dense forests of the accursed mountains, named for their treacherous terrain, produced oak with a unique combination of strength and flexibility. Venetian surveyors marked the finest trees with red paint years before felling, ensuring only prime timber made the journey. But transporting these giants to the sea was a feat of engineering. Albanian loggers carved makeshift slides down mountainsides, guiding trunks with ropes during spring thaws when the wood was slick with sap. In coastal villages like Schengen, teams of oxen dragged logs into the shallows, where they were lashed into rafts and towed by Venetian galleys across the Adriatic. The operation was so precise that the arsenal's foreman could predict supply down to the month, synchronizing shipments with shipbuilding cycles. The trade scale was staggering. Archives from 1420 show Venice importing over 3,000 tons of Albanian oak annually, enough to build 12 galleys from keel to mast. This wasn't just raw material, it was strategic security. When the Ottomans threatened to blockade Venetian ports, the Republic accelerated logging contracts, stockpiling Albanian timber like medieval ammunition. Shipwrights even adjusted designs to match available resources, crafting hulls from shorter Albanian planks when Balkan wars disrupted deliveries of Dalmatian fur. Yet the human cost was hidden beneath the varnish. Albanian chronicles tell of entire villages conscripted into logging, their farms neglected during critical planting seasons. The famous Canon Law Code, still followed in highland communities, contains clauses specifically regulating timber disputes with Venetian buyers. Some clans grew rich as middlemen, while others resisted 15th-century tax records note villages paying fines in timber instead of coin, a quiet protest against exploitation. The most enduring legacy of this trade wasn't in ships but in skills. Albanian woodworkers brought techniques like steam bending to Venice, allowing curved hull sections that made galleys more maneuverable. In return, Venetian naval architects trained Albanian apprentices, creating a hybrid school of shipbuilding that later influenced Ottoman dockyards. When the great Albanian commander Skanderbeg revolted against the Ottomans in the 1440s, his rebels didn't just burn Venetian timber stores, they commandeered them to build their own fleet, turning their oppressors' resource against them. This silent exchange of wood and knowledge reveals a deeper truth. Maritime empires weren't built by admirals alone. They relied on forgotten networks of loggers, ox drivers, and bargemen, men who never set foot on a warship but whose labor floated every vessel. The oak that withstood Ottoman cannon at Lepanto in 1571 began its journey generations earlier as a sapling in an Albanian glade, its destiny written not in battle plans but in the grain of the forest. The Knights Hospitaller didn't just defend Christendom, they terrorized the Mediterranean with a fleet of holy pirates. After losing their last foothold in the Holy Land in 1291, these warrior monks transformed themselves into something far more unpredictable, seaborne raiders who turned the eastern Mediterranean into their personal battleground. Based on the island of Rhodes, which they seized in 1309, they launched a maritime crusade unlike anything Europe had seen. Their galleys, painted black with the order's distinctive white cross, became a nightmare for Muslim merchants. This wasn't just war, it was sanctified piracy where every captured ship funded their holy cause. What made the Hospitallers so effective was their hybrid identity. Part navy, part monastic order, they combined the discipline of knights with the cunning of corsairs. Their ships flew the papal banner, granting them a veneer of legitimacy, but their tactics were pure opportunism. They lurked near major trade routes between Alexandria and Constantinople, targeting Fatimid grain ships one day and Ottoman spice traders the next. Prisoners faced grim choices: conversion to Christianity, enslavement in Rhodian docks, or ransom payments that swelled the order's coffers. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers called them sea wolves, their attacks so frequent that Egyptian sultans began diverting entire convoys just to avoid Rhodian waters. The real genius of their operation lay in its self-sufficiency. Unlike traditional crusades that relied on distant European patrons, the Hospitallers funded themselves through plunder. A single captured merchant vessel carrying Sicilian wheat or Cypriot cotton could finance months of operations. Their account books from 1420 reveal astonishing details: the sale of 600 bales of Syrian silk seized off Crete, or the auction of 200 enslaved oarsmen taken from an Ottoman galley. This wasn't just pillaging, it was a fully integrated economy of holy war where violence and commerce became indistinguishable, yet their impact extended beyond economics. The Hospitallers' raids forced Muslim powers to divert resources from land campaigns to coastal defense. Mamluk Egypt built a chain of watchtowers along the Levantine coast, while the Ottomans developed early convoy systems, precursors to the naval strategies that would later dominate the Mediterranean. Ironically, the Knights' piracy accelerated the very naval advancements that would eventually doom their stronghold. When Suleiman the Magnificent finally expelled them from Rhodes in 1522, it wasn't just a defeat for Christendom, it was the end of an era where faith could justify predation on the high seas. Their legacy, though, lingers in unexpected ways. The Hospitallers' mastery of naval guerrilla tactics influenced later Christian privateers like the Knights of Malta. Their intelligence networks, which stretched from Venetian trading posts to Armenian monasteries, set the standard for maritime espionage. Most strikingly, their ability to sustain a century-long crusade without papal subsidies proved something revolutionary: that holy war could be a self-funding enterprise. In an age where faith and finance were supposed to be separate, the Hospitallers wrote a different playbook. one where every captured dhow and ransacked caravan wasn't just profit, but prayer in motion. The legend of Prince Madoc sailing west from Wales in the 12th century sounds like pure fantasy until you consider how stubbornly it clung to history's edges. While Norse sagas documented their voyages to North America, Madoc's story lived in murkier territory, a mix of Welsh poetry, Cherokee oral traditions, and hopeful Elizabethan propaganda. According to the tale, this disgruntled prince fled family strife, steering his ship into the sunset until he reached an unknown land where his crew settled among friendly strangers. By the time John Dee, Queen Elizabeth's court scholar, revived the story in the 1580s, it had taken on new urgency, proof that England could claim the New World before Spain. What makes Madoc's myth fascinating isn't its veracity, but its utility. When early colonists reported encounters with Welsh-speaking Native Americans, likely a misheard dialect or wishful thinking, the legend gained fresh traction. Even Lewis and Clark were instructed to watch for Welsh Indians during their expedition. The story's durability reveals a deeper truth. Medieval Europe's maritime expansion wasn't just fueled by maps and compasses, but by stories that blurred the line between rumor and reality. Archaeology adds tantalizing crumbs. A 12th century Welsh fortification style appears at certain Mississippi Valley sites, while the Mandan tribe's riverine culture, with its round boats and fortified villages, bore curious parallels to medieval Welsh practices. These fragments don't prove Madoc's voyage happened, but they show how legends could shape exploration's very framework. When later adventurers like Columbus and Raleigh set sail, they carried more than navigational charts, they carried myths that made the unknown feel conquerable. The real legacy of Madoc's tale lies in its psychological power. In an age when most sailors still feared falling off the Earth's edge, stories of predecessors surviving the Atlantic void offered something priceless: permission to imagine. Whether fact or fable, such narratives turned the ocean from a barrier into a bridge, proving that sometimes the most navigable routes aren't drawn on parchment, but etched into collective dreams. These 25 little-known ventures rewrite the story we thought we knew about Europe's rise as a maritime power. Behind every famous explorer stood dozens of unnamed sailors who charted the first tentative routes, merchants who funded risky voyages for goods we now take for granted, and fishermen who followed the fish further than anyone thought possible. The Norse in Greenland, the Basque whalers, the Breton navigators, none of them set out to change the world, yet their combined footsteps across the waves created pathways that empires would later march down. What's astonishing isn't just the distances they covered, but the mindsets they shattered. Medieval Europe wasn't some monolithic entity straining against the limits of the known world. It was a patchwork of individuals who looked at the horizon and asked, what if? Take the Hanseatic League's cogs, floating stock exchanges that turned the Baltic into a marketplace, or the Ragusan merchants who outmaneuvered empires with nothing but shrewd diplomacy and fast ships. These weren't acts of destiny, they were choices made by people who refused to accept that the ocean was a barrier. The real lesson here lies in the quiet revolutions. The Breton fishermen who decoded the Gulf Stream's secrets didn't write manifestos, but their knowledge later propelled Columbus. The Albanian loggers who felled trees for Venetian galleys never set foot on those ships, yet their labor defended Christendom at Lepanto. History loves its lone geniuses and conquering heroes, but the truth is messier and far more interesting. Progress didn't leap from one famous voyage to the next. It crept forward on the decks of unremarkable ships carrying salted fish, timber, and ordinary people chasing better lives. So the next time you see a medieval map with its dragons and swirling seas, remember this: those blank spaces weren't filled in by crowns and armies, but by the collective courage of countless souls who dared to sail beyond the edges. Their stories remind us that exploration isn't just about planting flags, it's about the invisible threads that bind the world together, one voyage at a time. If you've enjoyed uncovering these forgotten journeys, hit subscribe. We've only scratched the surface of history's hidden tides. The astrolabe wasn't just a tool, it was a medieval smartphone, compressing the vast complexity of the cosmos into a handheld brass disc. Picture a ship's captain in the 15th century, balancing this intricate device against the roll of the waves, aligning its pierced ruler with the North Star to calculate latitude. What seems primitive today was revolutionary then, a machine that could translate the heavens into numbers, turning guesswork into navigation. But the astrolabe's true genius lay in its adaptability. Arab scholars had perfected it centuries earlier, and European sailors, encountering it through trade in ports like Lisbon and Palermo, didn't just adopt it, they hacked it. Mariners scrapped the ornate Arabic zodiac engravings, simplifying the design for rough hands and stormy skies. The result, a rugged, seaworthy version that could survive salt spray and clumsy fingers, proof that the best technologies aren't always invented, they're inherited and improved. Then there were the Portolan charts, which made medieval Google Maps look abstract by comparison. Unlike traditional mappamundi filled with mythical creatures and biblical scenes, these were all business, coastlines drawn with obsessive precision, compass roses radiating lines like spiderwebs, and cryptic notations warning of shallow reefs or pirate coves. The earliest surviving example, the carte pisane from the late 13th century, reveals their pragmatic brilliance. Its creator didn't care about the shape of the world, only the details that mattered to sailors. Distances were measured in days' sails, while symbols marked reliable freshwater springs. These charts weren't just guides, they were collaborative projects, updated with marginal notes by generations of captains. A smudged annotation near Gibraltar might read, "Current stronger in March," while another off Brittany warned, "Fog here in autumn." This was crowdsourcing before the internet, a living database of hard-won knowledge. But the unsung hero of medieval navigation was the humble magnetic compass, a Chinese innovation that reached Europe via Silk Road traders. Early versions were laughably simple, a magnetized needle floating in a bowl of water, but they shattered a fundamental barrier, cloudy skies. Before compasses, sailors clung to coastlines, terrified of losing sight of land. Now they could venture into the open ocean even when stars vanished behind storm clouds. The real breakthrough came when navigators noticed something odd: their needles didn't always point true north. This magnetic variation, first documented by a monk in 1269, became a secret weapon. Experienced captains learned to adjust their routes based on these subtle deviations, turning what seemed like a flaw into a feature. The most surprising tool, though, required no metal or parchment at all, just memory. Norse sailors used a sunstone, likely a piece of Icelandic spar crystal, to locate the sun through overcast skies by detecting polarized light. Modern experiments prove it works eerily well. With practice, a navigator could pinpoint the sun's position within a few degrees, even at twilight. Combine this with the Vikings' bearing dial, a wooden disc that tracked shadows, and you have a navigation system so robust it guided ships from Bergen to Newfoundland without a single written map. What ties these innovations together isn't just ingenuity, it's humility. Medieval sailors understood that no single tool held all the answers. Astrolabes failed in rough seas, compasses lied near magnetic rocks, and Portolan charts couldn't predict storms. The real skill lay in weaving them together, checking the compass against the stars, correcting charts with fresh sightings, and always trusting the instincts of those who'd sailed further. This wasn't just technology enabling exploration. It was a dialogue between human curiosity and the tools that made it possible. Long before GPS satellites, these quiet inventions whispered the same essential truth. The world was always meant to be crossed, one careful calculation at a time.